Hi, I'm Dr. Tony Evans, your host for Heroes in the Bible. If you've enjoyed this podcast so far, please share it with your family and friends and help us spread God's word. Welcome to the epic adventure of David, a story of honor, battle, jealousy, darkness, friendship, love, scandal, and murder. While most people know of David the myth, few know about David the man. In this episode, the meteoric rise of David is put to a halt by Saul. Up until this point, David has had nothing but victories. He has slain giants, defeated armies, fallen in love, and gained allies. But now, our hero faces his toughest challenge yet. His resilience and patience will be put through the gauntlet, and he will be betrayed by more than one ally. The time has come for David to be put to the ultimate test. This episode is the beginning of a very long season in David's life, a time when he isn't in the comfort of his father's home or the favorite champion of the palace. David is going to be sent on the run, and we will be left with uncertainty on who he will become. This episode introduces us to a new character, Abner. Although his time is brief in this episode, we should pay attention to him. He will be very important later on in the story. David will also visit an old friend. I won't give away who, though. You will have to listen to find out. This friend will remind David of his calling and give him boldness for the fight ahead. Before all this transpires, we will open up with a prelude, a story taken from the days of old before Israel was a nation or the law was written into stone. Another chosen hero will be forced to leave in fear of a loved one. But what God does with him in exile is worth it. God does glorious things in exile, as we will come to see in later episodes. Let's learn more about God's faithfulness in Episode 8, Exiled.
Prelude to Chapter 8. The heat of the day had finally disappeared as the sun set over the mountains. From the forests of Canaan, Esau emerged with a deer carried on his shoulders. His broad and muscular frame marched home. Esau dropped the deer, skinned it, and prepared the meat for his father. A fragrant stew boiled under the fire. Esau smiled, pleased with the work of his hands. He poured the stew into a bowl and walked into his father's tent. Isaac was laying in bed, old, blind, and near death. Esau knelt beside his father and handed him the bowl.
My father, I have returned from the hunt. I have prepared your favorite stew. Take and eat, so that you might bless me before you pass.
Isaac propped himself up in his bed and reached for his son's face. Esau leaned forward and let him place his hand on his cheek. Confused, Isaac pulled away and said,
"Who is this that I am speaking to?"
I am your firstborn son, Esau. I have returned from my hunt so that you might bless me according to my birthright.
Isaac's old hand began to tremble. Esau reached to take it, but his father pulled away in frustration.
Who is it then that brought me food before? There was another who came in here, saying he was my firstborn Esau. It was to him I gave the blessing.
Esau panicked. He shook his head and raised his voice.
No, father. I swear, I am Esau. Whoever came before me was an imposter. It wasn't me. It must have been...
He paused and looked around the tent. An empty bowl was beside the bed, and a pile of goat's fur rested at the entrance.
Jacob.
He whispered.
It was Jacob. He tricked my father into...
Esau looked up at Isaac and took his hand.
Please, father. Please, bless me as well. Have you not reserved any blessing for me? Please, do not leave me here alone.
Sorrow, rage, and anguish welled up in Esau's heart. His brother had tricked him into giving up his birthright. And now he had stolen what mattered most, his father's blessing. Isaac was enraged at Jacob, yet could not recant his blessing over him. And he would not undo what the Lord had set in motion.
I have made him Lord over you,
Isaac said.
I have blessed him as an inheritor of all God has given me, and you will serve under him.
Esau's face fell into his hands. A deep well of sorrow raged within him.
Is there any blessing you can give me, Father? Am I not worthy of anything?
Isaac rested his hand on his son's head. He breathed in deeply and recited ancient poetry. The words were a poor consolation. To Esau, they might as well have been a complete rejection. Isaac spoke thus, saying,
Behold, away from the richness of the earth you shall dwell, and away from the dew of heaven on high. You shall live by your sword, and you shall serve your brother. But when you grow restless, you shall break his yoke from your neck.
Esau left his father and stood over the fire. His large chest was huffing with anger. A dark part of Esau's heart was awakened that day. A spirit of jealousy and contempt overwhelmed him. When Isaac had breathed his last and went to be with his father Abraham, Esau sighed a deep breath and said,
The days of mourning my father are approaching. After I mourn, I will kill my brother Jacob.
Jacob caught wind of this and fled out of his country. The hero God had chosen was made an exile from his own country, fleeing from his own family. Chapter 8. Exiled.
The unity of our nation is under attack!
Saul yelled from the war room in his palace. Torchlight flickered against Saul's body, casting a large shadow over the coarse stone walls. His trusted servants and advisors stood around the king, along with a few of the elders. A single tapestry draped over the back wall. The firelight illuminated its elegant design of the nation of Israel, all 12 tribes represented in a single map. The king drew out a dagger and tore the tapestry in two.
Don't you see what he has done to their people? They praise him as if he is the Lord himself. We cannot have him dividing us and drawing the people away from me. If they do not trust me over David, we will have a civil war on our hands. He will revolt against us when the moment is right for him.
The elders and advisors mumbled amongst themselves. Some agreed, but others were skeptical of whether the king was in his right mind. Remaining in the back with his shoulder leaning against the wall was Jonathan. He listened intently to his father's ravings against David. They were the rants of a paranoid madman. However, he was king, and absolute power to execute David was his. Saul flailed his arms and swung his dagger.
We will make it look like an accident. The last thing we desire is for the people to turn against me for killing him. Or perhaps we could frame the Philistines. No doubt the people would believe they assassinated the giant slayer.
Jonathan's heart beat swiftly as he listened to Saul plan out his best friend's murder. He waited for a moment to slip away to warn David. As Saul got caught up in planning with his advisors, Jonathan slipped away into the shadows. He ran swiftly through the palace gardens and down the road where David and Michal lived. The sky was thick with marks of midnight. The stars spread over the horizon like a steady moving tide. The cool evening breeze slipped through the window of David's room, caressing his cheek. He brought the blankets in and rolled closer to Michal. He enjoyed the warm company of his bride. Never before had he felt such a serene sense of belonging. He belonged to God's chosen people, to the armies of Israel, to the house of King Saul, and to his beloved wife. It seemed as though nothing could steal away the bliss David had rightfully earned. In the stillness of the cold night, wrapped in blankets, David sighed and thanked God for his grace towards him. David closed his eyes and slipped into a deep sleep. His weary and battle-hardened bones were growing heavy as he sank into his bed. He dreamt of green pastures and still waters. He dreamed of the babbling brooks and baas of the sheep. All was peaceful, until a hand reached out from the darkness over his mouth. David awoke in a panic and reached desperately for his dagger. Just as he was about to strike, he saw the moonlight illuminating Jonathan's face. He placed a finger over his lips and gestured for him to join him outside. David nodded and slipped quietly out of bed so Michal could remain asleep. The two men stepped outside into the cold. David wrapped the royal robe Jonathan had given him around his shoulders. Jonathan was clearly nervous. He always stroked his beard when he was nervous. David placed his hand on his shoulder.
What is this about, Jonathan? What is troubling you?
Jonathan placed his hands on David's face.
You are in danger, little brother. My father seeks to take your life. It could be tonight, or it could be next week, but his mind seems to be set on killing you.
David gave an impassive nod.
I see,
he said solemnly.
You do not seem too surprised by this.
Jonathan inquired.
Is there something you're not telling me?
David crossed his arms, trying to keep himself warm under the crisp evening air. A soft breeze made his hair fall over his eyes as he looked down.
Your father has tried to kill me already,
David said.
He attempted to pin me to the wall with his spear. When he missed, he sent another one. I escaped before he could throw a third.
Why didn't you tell any of this to me?
Because your father is a troubled soul, but more importantly, he is my king.
David said sternly.
It is my duty to give him mercy for any slights against me. After all, it was not too long after that he gave me your sister's hand in marriage.
Jonathan shook his head.
Your loyalty may be your undoing, Giant Slayer.
It may be yours as well, brother.
David said seriously.
You are taking a great risk by being here to warn me. Tell me, what should I do?
Be on your guard in the morning. Stay in a secret place and hide yourself. Tomorrow I will go out into the fields with my father. I will speak well of you and test to see where his heart is. Allow me to be your advocate.
David smiled and hugged Jonathan. He held him tightly.
People with unreliable friends meet early deaths. But there are friends who stick closer than brothers.
Jonathan patted David on the back.
I will let you know if I hear anything from my father. Stay safe and stay hidden for now.
David went back into his home, being sure to keep his dagger even closer. Jonathan slipped back across the garden back home. On the other side of the palace, Saul sat awake near the fire. His mind wandered into unpleasant places like a ship lost at sea. His weary mind slipped in and out of sleep, until eventually he passed out on his throne. The next morning, Jonathan arose early to meet his father in the farmlands of Gibeah. Saul took great care into ensuring the vibrancy of Israel's agriculture and livestock. He needed his people well fed. Hungry citizens made for fickle followers. He needed their loyalty. He craved it. Jonathan walked the fields with his father. They spoke of the kingdom, battle strategy, and their family. Despite all his flaws, Jonathan loved his father. He admired his steadfast attention to the safety of Israel. As the two of them spoke, Jonathan was able to see small glimpses of why his father was chosen to be king in the first place. Lingering impressions of past humility made brief appearances. Saul was not always the paranoid and unstable man that stood before him. He was once a prince of promise and a beacon of hope to the infant nation of Israel.
Father, there is a matter I wish to speak to you about.
Jonathan said shyly.
Speak,
Saul said, enjoying the sunlight on his cheeks.
Your anger against David seems irrational to me. What has he done wrong?
Saul paused his stride and looked down at his son.
It is not what he has done, Jonathan, but what he will do. The people have given him glory and honor. It is only a matter of time before they seek to give him the kingdom. Your kingdom.
God's kingdom, Father.
Jonathan responded. Saul scoffed and dismissed the correction with a wave of his hand. Jonathan persisted.
I beg you to not sin against your servant David. He has not sinned against you. His deeds have brought you and this nation nothing but prosperity. When you and I were faced with the option of standing up to the giant, we wavered, yet he stood on our behalf. The Lord has clearly worked good through him. Why would you seek to put that good to an early end? You yourself rejoiced when he slew Goliath. Why shed innocent blood against a faithful warrior, a trusted servant, and your son-in-law?
Saul looked down at the ground beneath his feet. Although the ground was firm and easy to walk on, he felt uneasy and off balance. Saul had not felt right for a very long time. He felt his senses and his mind dull with paranoia and contempt. He sighed and looked at his son. He knew he was right. David had truly done nothing to deserve such hatred. For a brief moment, Saul could see clearly. He placed his hand on his son's shoulder.
You are a wise man, my son. As the Lord lives, David shall not be harmed by my hand.
Saul smiled, then continued walking. Relieved, Jonathan found David and told him the news. David was restored to be in the presence of Saul once again. He attended meetings for battle strategy. He sat with his family for feasts and parties. He played music for him beside his throne. All seemed well, and normalcy was restored, until the Philistines mounted yet another attack. Thunder roared from the heavens. A storm of great force was blowing in from the north. David stood with his men atop a hill, ready to descend into the battlefield against the Philistines. The enemy horde banged their swords against their shields, beckoning David to them. The giant slayer looked up, watching the heavens stir violently. Rain was coming. It would not be a clean fight. There was no time to waste. The longer they waited, the less advantage they had. David raised his sword high in the air and slashed it downward. His archers sent a flurry of arrows towards the Philistines. They retaliated with just as many. The skies crackled with wood and metal as the rains began to fall. David ran first towards the enemy, with his men to his back. They all followed with courageous vigor. The two armies met in the middle of the battlefield. The thunder and rain drowned out the cracking bone and tearing flesh. It was the most gruesome battle David had ever seen. From every angle, another one of his men fell to a Philistine. He swiped through the enemy lines, leaving dozens of bodies in his wake.
Press in!
He yelled.
Do not lose heart!
David's cries pierced through the white noise of wind and rain. His men were emboldened by his courage. They struggled through mud and filth, slowly gaining the advantage over the Philistines. David never let go of his sword. Every attack the Philistines mounted against him failed. The Lord was before him, and his men knew that they were in the presence of God's chosen hero. The skies ceased their onslaught of rain and lightning. All was still for a moment. David paused to look around him. He was on top of a hill on the enemy's side of the battlefield. He looked behind him. His men were standing, seeing that they had killed every last Philistine that came up against them. Nearly 100 men lay dead at their feet. Through all the struggle, they never lost hope. David drove his sword into the mud and fell to his knees. He looked up to the heavens. The sun was peeking out through the darkened skies, and it seemed as though the Lord was smiling down at them. David wept, and the soldiers cheered. They rejoiced at David's bravery and leadership. Word of the victory reached the ears of Saul. As he listened to the men swoon over the giant slayer's bravery, the tormenting spirit returned, and he forgot all about his promise to Jonathan. He once again longed to see David pinned to the wall of the palace with his spear. David's music filled the throne room. The melody was unfamiliar to Saul. It had a different rising and falling than David's typical songs of praise. This song was filled with a rising hope that continued to build until the very last moment. The joy expressed in the music was like a burning coal upon Saul's brooding heart. He hated David's connection to the Lord. He hated David's victories and his humility. Everything David was, Saul hated. The light of David's countenance made the darkness in Saul's heart ever more apparent. Saul once again gripped his spear tightly and stood to his feet. He yelled and hurled the spear at the shepherd. However, David was prepared for another attack from Saul. He shifted to his left, and the spear flew right past his shoulder and pierced the cedar beam behind him. David stood there facing the king. Saul's brows furrowed and nostrils flared. Hatred had spilled over, and David saw in the king the same eyes as Goliath. It was no longer safe to be in his presence. As Saul began to mount another attack, David escaped through the back door and ran into the night. David burst through the door of his home. Michal startled from her bed.
What happened?
She asked worriedly.
This is the second time your father has attempted to kill me.
David explained.
Before, I thought it was an outburst of anger, so I forgave him. However, now I know he wants me dead.
Michal was in shock. Her eyes widened and she frantically ran to the window and looked out into the darkness. Small torchlights could be seen nearly 50 yards away. Michal knew her father well. If he wanted David dead, and was unable to do so in private, he would have his servants do it for him.
My father's men are lurking in the shadows,
she said in a hushed tone.
It is not safe for you to be here. They will wait for you to come out in the morning and slit your throat.
David pulled his hair back tight and groaned.
What options are there? I cannot fight the king's men. They are my countrymen.
Michal grabbed her husband's face with both her hands.
Listen to me. If you do not escape tonight, they will kill you. You must leave.
David shook his head and held Michal's hands in his.
I will not leave you. I will not leave Jonathan or my men. Perhaps I can reason with Saul. He is my father-in-law. Perhaps the Lord will change his heart.
Michal released David's grasp and began packing up food in a sack.
You are a good man, David, but woefully innocent when it comes to my father. He has not listened to the Lord in years. You must go. Jonathan and I will be okay, and your men will always be loyal to you. But none of us want to see you dead.
She grabbed David's face and brought it close to hers. She kissed him passionately and smiled. The two of them fastened a rope together, and David lowered himself out the window, escaping into the hills outside the city. Michal took pillows and hid them under blankets to look like David. She put goat's fur on the top to look like his hair, then crawled into bed and waited up all night. She knew the servants would come in the morning to kill David. It was only a matter of time. Early that morning, Michal heard a knocking at the door.
Who is it?
She asked ignorantly, although she knew it was her father's men come to kill David. At the door was Abner, the commander of Saul's army and most trusted servant and advisor. Saul had sent him personally to see to David's death. He trusted no one more than Abner.
"We come from your father, my lady,"
he said.
"We are here to speak with your husband. Could you get him?"
Michal's heart began to pound in her chest. She heroically saved her husband, but she was now growing more nervous for her own safety. Panicked, Michal cleared her throat and said,
He is ill. You will have to come by tomorrow. I am afraid he is in bed and cannot get up.
"We have strict orders from the king, Michal."
Abner replied sternly.
"We will visit him in the room."
The men made their way in without Michal's permission, slowly opening the door into their room. They drew their swords, unwilling to take their chances with such a formidable opponent like David. Abner took his sword and raised it into the air. He drove it down into the bed, being sure to put all his weight into it. His men joined in, stabbing and slashing down at the figure in the bed. However, it did not take long for feathers and fur to begin pouring out from under the blankets. Abner threw off the blankets, revealing the pillows and goatskins. He turned back violently with his sword drawn at Michal.
"Where is he?
Abner yelled.
Where is David?"
Michal fell down onto the floor crying. Abner rolled his eyes back and sheathed his sword.
"Go get the king."
He ordered his men.
"The last thing I want is to harm his daughter trying to get the truth."
Saul's men beckoned him to David and Michal's home. He stormed in with thundering anger. His large frame and deep voice shook the house, and Michal quivered in fear from her father. He had never hurt her, but he was clearly not in his right mind. He had attempted to pin David to the wall twice with his spear. There was no clear limit to what he would do. Saul bent down to his daughter, who was crying on the floor next to the bed. His anger could be seen through his teeth.
"Daughter,"
he said, holding back his outrage.
"where is he?"
Michal had a decision to make. Would she honor her husband or pander to her father? She weighed her options. It was very likely that David would remain on the run for a very long while. Michal was used to a life of luxury and privilege. As much as she loved David, she loved her comforts more. She looked up.
Oh, Father,
she said, wrapping her arms around his neck.
Thank the Lord you have come. David threatened my life. He told me that he would kill me if I did not help him escape.
Tears ran down her face. However, they were tears of shame and guilt for what she was doing. Saul held his daughter, appalled at her words. Even he, who hated David, could not believe he would do such a thing.
I promise you, my daughter, I will find him and destroy him. He will not hurt you again.
Saul stood up and gestured for Abner.
Send out scouts. Have them search for David, but tell no one we want his life. I cannot have people rising up to protect him.
Abner nodded, and he sent men throughout the city to search for David. David ran all day until he arrived at Naioth in Ramah. The sun was setting, creating a crimson glow over the horizon. On any other day, it would have been worth sitting on the hill to write songs about the glory of God. But this day was different. David needed protection. So he sought wisdom from the only man he truly trusted. He walked up a dirt pathway leading to a house sitting on a hill overlooking the city. David felt a distinct shift in the air as he approached the home. He looked to his left, seeing a stone altar covered in blood. Smoke rose from an opening in the roof, and flickering light came through the windows. David approached the large wooden door and knocked. He stepped back and waited. The door opened, and the sweet smell of incense and cooked meat released into the air near David. The young shepherd immediately bowed.
I am sorry for disturbing you. I had nowhere else to go.
The figure standing before him limped its way outside and leaned down to him. David looked up to see the old and gray face of Samuel smiling. He had not seen him since he was anointed in Bethlehem. His presence was warm and comforting. A few tears streamed down David's cheeks. In such a short period of time, David had gone from a forgotten shepherd boy to a famed warrior. Seeing Samuel made him feel like a child again.
Come,
Samuel's raspy and dusty voice said,
we shall worship the Lord together, and he shall deliver you from the vengeance of Saul.
David took Samuel by the arm, and the two of them walked into his home. Samuel's students were sitting by the fire enjoying a meal. David sat among them and told them all of what had happened. He spoke into the night, sharing all the things the Lord had done since he defeated Goliath. He told tales of Jonathan, Michal, and the armies of Israel. He shared about the disturbed nature of Saul and his attempts to kill him. In everything, Samuel and his students were silent. They allowed David to pour out his emotions and soul. They allowed him to cry, laugh, and pray. Then after sharing a good meal, they sent David to bed to rest. They knew that Saul and his men would be there soon. They had to pray to the Lord for protection and provision. If David truly was the anointed and chosen king, no doubt God would provide.
One of our men came back with reports of David seen near Ramah,
Abner said to the king. Saul leaned back on his throne, brooding over a cup of wine. His eyes darted over to Abner. He snarled and took a sip.
No doubt he has gone to see Samuel. Both of them are probably conspiring against me as we speak. Go and take David by any means necessary.
Abner bowed, and he sent men to retrieve David from Naioth and Ramah. The next day, Saul's men walked up the dirt path with their swords drawn. They could see the smoke rising from the home. Outside the home, Samuel and his students were prophesying and worshiping the Lord. Samuel stood in front of them with his hands raised. They declared the goodness and justice of God and proclaimed his mighty acts on the hilltop. As the men drew closer with their swords drawn, they felt a shift in the air. Their hearts began to flutter in their chests, and the Spirit of God fell down upon them. Overwhelmed with the sense of God's presence, they too began to prophesy and worship. They had come to take David violently, but instead, they were met with a fortified wall of praise and worship. God had protected his chosen king, not with weapons of warfare, but with his Spirit moving in the hearts of wicked men. The men returned empty-handed, but beaming with the joy of the Lord. Their spiritual glow vexed Saul. His anger was kindled against his men when he heard that they had worshipped God instead of obeying him. Saul stood up from his throne and rode to Ramah himself with 12 men behind him. He came heavily armed and prepared to fight. He knew that David was a mighty warrior, and somehow Samuel and his prophets had cast a spell on his men. Saul charged up the hill leading up to Samuel's home. As he crossed the threshold, Saul could feel the presence of God like the embrace of an old friend from years ago. Saul ceased his charge and paused. He looked down at his hands and his feet, not sure what to do. He took a step further, seeing Samuel's students praying only a few yards away. He approached them, and the tug of God's Spirit became overwhelming. Saul fell to his hands and knees. His heart ached from the burst of benevolent power rushing through him like a mighty river. It was almost too much for him to bear. Saul looked up to the heavens with tears rushing down his face. He knew that the Lord was only revealing himself to protect David. He even knew in his heart that he would not change his ways. Nevertheless, he was grateful. Grateful that he could experience the Spirit of God once again, even for just a brief moment. Saul tore his royal robes and began to worship and prophesy with the others. After this, the Spirit of the Lord compelled him to depart. David watched out the window at the king leaving down the hill. He turned to Samuel, who was sitting by the fire once again. Samuel beckoned him over and had him sit beside him. David spoke first, saying,
Thank you for all you have done. However, I put you and your students in danger by being here. I shall leave tonight.
Samuel smiled and tilted his head towards the fire. The coals had been tended to carefully by Samuel. They beat like tiny little hearts in the flame. A few of the coals popped. He looked at David sitting beside him. His eyes were attentive to Samuel's every move.
Are you able to keep the coals burning?
Samuel asked. His voice was deep and sonorous. Even in his old age, his voice maintained its resonant authority. It was as if the words of God flowed out of his mouth from a deep cavern. David looked at the fire.
I am not sure.
David said honestly,
I suppose the flames are both started and sustained by the Lord.
Samuel said nothing. He touched David's head as he did the first day they met. He prayed with him, and then sent him on his way. David disappeared into the night back to Gibeah. He needed to speak with Jonathan. The dual nature of Saul had left him confused. Was he able to mend his relationship with Saul? Would he be able to reconcile? Or was David forced to live on the run forever? He needed such answers. Jonathan sat on a large stone wall looking down at the fields of grain outside his home. The gentle evening wind made the grain move like the seas. The sound of crickets chirping harmonized with the whistles of the breeze coming in from the east. It was a place David and he would often meet. They would speak of war, the wonders of God, and their dreams for the future. Jonathan would often chuckle at David, comparing everything to herding sheep. As the wind picked up speed across the fields, Jonathan could have sworn he heard a voice say his name.
Jonathan.
The voice whispered.
Jonathan.
It said again. The young prince looked down the hill sloping into the fields. David was there, resting his back against a stone. Jonathan hopped off the wall and embraced David.
I thought you had left forever.
Jonathan exclaimed.
My father has been mad in search of you.
What was my crime, Jonathan? What is my guilt? That your father would seek my life? Have I not served him faithfully? Have I not honored him?
David was frantic and frustrated. He was weary from hiding and becoming flustered from the sleepless nights. Jonathan reassured David and put his arm around him.
My father vowed to me that he would not kill you. I do not believe he will.
Jonathan said in ignorance.
My father does nothing without first disclosing it to me. If he had planned on killing you, he would tell me. Surely he is looking for you because of something else.
David shook his head. He paused and looked out at the fields. The breeze and sound of moving grass reminded him of simpler times with his sheep. David, still looking forward, said,
Your father knows we are closer than brothers. He would not tell you of his plans to kill me again. He probably suspects
You are the one who warned me in the first place that he would kill me.
My loyalty is to you before my father, David. We have a bond and an unbreakable covenant. Tell me what you need, and I'll do whatever you want.
Jonathan said. David looked over at his friend. For so long he had been alone. Even in the large family of Jesse, David was always the outcast, the runt. His heart was full of gladness for his friend Jonathan. He feared that in the midst of the chaos, he would be abandoned and left. David smiled and looked up at the moon. He pointed to it and said,
Tomorrow is the new moon. Many people will be gathering to celebrate. Your father will probably be expecting me to feast with him and the elders. I am his son-in-law, and to not attend would be a great insult to him. I will hide instead, and you will tell him I am in Bethlehem making a sacrifice with my clan. It will no doubt enrage him and kindle his anger towards me even greater. However, if your father respects my decision to be with my kinsman, then we will know he means me no harm.
What if he is outraged?
Jonathan asked.
What would that tell us?
If your father is angry, it will show his heart,
David said. He paused again. Tears began to well up in David's eyes.
You should have seen the hatred in his eyes, Jonathan.
David whispered.
You should have seen the disdain he had for me. He looked at me like I was an abomination. I might as well have been a Philistine to him.
David drew his sword and handed it to Jonathan.
You and I have made a covenant with one another. You have sworn to protect me. However, if you see any guilt in me, please drive this sword into my chest.
Never!
Jonathan yelled, pushing away David's sword.
Get up. Come with me.
Jonathan lifted David up, and the two of them walked down to the fields. They stood there listening to the humming of the wind and the chirping of crickets. Jonathan pointed to the caves nestled in the hills beyond the field.
You hide out in the caves beyond this field. I'll send word of my father's temperament.
Thank you, brother.
Jonathan breathed in deeply and sighed.
Remember what I told you before when I gave you my armor and robe?
He asked. His tone was serious.
I told you you would certainly become king. I still believe it, and I am certain my father believes it. That's why he hates you.
The wind ceased its whistling, and all was still for a moment. Jonathan choked on his words. He was holding back tears.
Sometimes I linger in the halls of the palace and listen to you play music to my father. You have a deep well of love for the Lord, David. Your music speaks to your relationship with God. He will show you favor wherever you go. He will exalt you as king and destroy all those who make you their enemy. All those who seek to destroy you now will be eliminated, and God will pave the way for your kingdom. Please, I beg you, show love to my house when God removes your enemies. Be kind to my wife and children.
David said nothing in response. He wanted to humbly reject Jonathan's prediction that he would be made king. However, David knew that it was what he was destined for. He had come to realize the reason Samuel anointed him in the pasture so long ago. He was chosen to be the next king of Israel, and David swore to show Jonathan and his entire household love and favor. Jonathan spoke again, saying,
In the next 3 days, I will go out into the field for target practice where you are hiding. I will shoot 3 arrows towards you and send my servant to go and retrieve them. And if you hear me yell, the arrows are on that side, it means the coast is clear for you to return. If you hear me yell, go further, run, then that means Saul is still seeking your life and you should flee.
You are a kind man, Jonathan,
David said.
I will wait here.
The two embraced, and Jonathan left to return to his family. David walked into the dark and rough openings in the hills. He set his belongings down and leaned his head against the cave. He sighed, and the echoes of his breath traveled deep into the caverns. The young shepherd closed his eyes and began singing a song to the Lord.
O Lord, my God, in you I take refuge. Save me from my pursuers. Deliver me. O Lord my God, if I have done this, if this is my evil doing, let the enemy pursue my soul and devour it like the lions. May they lay my glory in the dust. Selah.
As David sang, his heart was comforted. The Lord met him in his anguish. There was nowhere he could run where the love and passion of God could not follow. He drifted to sleep, wondering about the future of his life, his family, and his kingdom. The Moon Festival had begun, and the elders gathered to celebrate with Saul and his family. Saul wore his robe of elegant colors, flashing his wealth before the nobles of Israel. He paraded his family around like the jewels on his crown. However, when David's place at the king's table was empty, Saul took notice.
Where is the son of Jesse?
He asked Jonathan.
First he threatens my daughter's life, and now he has the gall to shirk his royal duties?
Jonathan peered across the table at his father. He did his best to read him, to look into his thoughts and motives.
David asked me if he could go back to Bethlehem to make a sacrifice with his clan. His father and brothers demanded it, so I allowed it.
Saul drove his knife into the table.
You foolish and useless son!
He yelled. Everyone at the table tightened and looked over at Jonathan. He was motionless and oddly unriled.
Do you think I'm a fool? I know you want him to be king in your place.
Saul took his plate of food and threw it against the wall. He picked up his spear and pointed it at his son.
You shame yourself and your mother. David is planning to rip this kingdom away from me.
Jonathan's face was impassive. Now he was witnessing his father's true colors. He stood up slowly and looked deeply into his father's eyes.
It is the Lord who has taken your kingdom away, Father, not David.
Saul took his spear and hurled it at Jonathan as he once did with David. He missed, and the spear was driven into the wall behind him. The room was silent. Saul was huffing in anger. He turned to Abner and his guards and yelled,
Go and find the boy. Do not rest until he is brought to me. I will have his head on a silver platter.
You will not!
Jonathan yelled violently. His blood boiled with anger. Saul had crossed the line, and Jonathan would not allow him to continue in his madness without a fight.
I will,
Saul said.
I will have his life, and you will not stop me. You are too weak to kill me.
With those words, Saul stormed off to gather his men. The hunt for David was about to begin. Jonathan arose early before the sunrise the next morning. He took his servant out into the field with a bow and arrow. To the servant, it was just Jonathan clearing his mind and practicing. He did not know David was resting in the caves only a few yards away. Jonathan shot 3 arrows into the distance where he knew David was hiding. He turned to his servant and said,
Start running. You'll find the arrows as I shoot them.
So the boy ran unknowingly in David's direction. The boy was close to where the arrows were, but Jonathan yelled,
Keep running! The arrow's still ahead of you. Hurry! Hurry! Do not wait even a moment!
David heard the words of warning. His heart ached. David looked over at the armor and sword given to him by Jonathan. He armed himself, girded up his clothes, and began to run. He fled into the wilderness, exiled and alone. However, God was at work in David's heart. He would not abandon his anointed one. Those whom the Lord chooses are never truly left to fend for themselves.
We all know this was bound to happen. The small thread of self-control Saul had was bound to snap. Unsurprisingly, he commits himself to David's destruction. The surprising part of this episode was that David refused to fight back. He slew a giant way scarier than the king, so none of us would be surprised if David somehow found a way to defeat Saul in combat. But our hero refused to retaliate against the king despite several attempts at his life. This is going to be a long and somewhat annoying theme in David's life. Sometimes he is honorable to a fault. Jonathan warned David that his loyalty may be his undoing one day. The giant slayer knows Jonathan might be right, but he respects the office of king far too much to overthrow it with violence. He knew that God put Saul on that throne and God would remove him as well. David felt no need to rush the hand of God, even if it meant his life would remain in jeopardy. This is an important lesson for all of us to learn from David. Many wrong paths are taken because we think they are shortcuts. We can get restless and feel pressure to rush God's will. Abraham and Sarah did this when they weren't getting pregnant, and that is how Ishmael was conceived. Little good comes from forcing God's promises through. It takes a lot of peace and trust to let events unfold the way David did. Waiting on God's timing does not mean we do nothing. David, when sensing a threat, is proactive and measured his actions. He does the right thing in this episode. He shows the king grace, all the while ensuring his own protection and leaning on those he trusts most. David receives the most help from his close friend Jonathan. The Prince of Israel revealed where his loyalties truly lie in this episode. When the pressure mounts and the stakes were high, he came through for David. I wish I could say the same about Michal. She was initially supportive of her husband and helped him escape, but when she was faced with her father, she wavered and lied. This is a theme in Scripture, but particularly in the story of David. Who we truly are is revealed when circumstances are at their toughest. Jonathan showed strength of his devotion to David by standing up to his father. Michal showed the weakness of her devotion to David by lying to her father. When life gets difficult, lies are easy shortcuts to make things easier on us. Once again, many wrong paths are taken because we think they are shortcuts. This episode shows us those who are willing to march up the uncomfortable path of righteousness and those who would rather take the easy way out. Saul, instead of facing his own demons and insecurities, wants to end David's life. Michal, instead of remaining loyal to her husband, gives David up. Doing the right thing is rarely easy, but it's always worth it. Lying, cheating, and taking the easy way out may seem better in the short run, but always presents us with more chaos. Brotherhood and loyalty are big themes in this episode as well. David, thankful for his friends, says, "People with unreliable friends meet early deaths, but there are friends who stick closer than brothers." This line was not taken from 1 Samuel, rather from Proverbs 18. It was spoken by Solomon, David's son. Many years were added to David's life because of his friendship with Jonathan. He would have most certainly been wiped out by Saul without him. Friendship is not just a luxury, it is a necessity. People without loyal friends are doomed to wander through life in fear. They have nobody to watch their backs, give them corrections, provide aid when needed, and celebrate their victories. We would be wise to look at Jonathan and ask ourselves if we are as loyal and trustworthy as he is to our friends. Let's talk about two particular events that happen in this episode. They connect everything back to the prelude. First, Samuel returns to the story, and not a moment too late. He protects David from harm and provides a safe haven from the wrath of Saul. God's Spirit hedges Samuel's property like a force field. When Abner and his men come to kill David, they are compelled to worship instead. God doesn't allow a single hair on David's head to be touched. The same happens when Saul attacks. The king comes with a sword ready, but instead falls to his knees in praise. This seems like an odd tactic for God to employ. Why not shoot Saul down with lightning or set his chariot on fire? The answer is compelling. God is committed to thwarting Saul through mercy. Romans 12:21 says, "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." There will be several times in the next dozen episodes when Saul should be utterly destroyed, but instead shown mercy. God, through David, is committing to overcome the evil in Saul's heart with good. If David is to take the throne, it will not be because David defeated him in battle. All that shows is that anyone can become king by slaying whoever is on the throne. This is a surefire way to destroy a nation. God will raise up David, but not before an intense testing. This episode ends with David running away into exile. His rise to prominence is halted, and the giant slayer is brought to his lowest point. Why would God allow this to happen? Why would God allow David to wander in the wilderness away from his calling? As it turns out, God does this sort of thing all the time. In our prelude, Jacob is forced into exile because he is afraid of his brother for good reason. Joseph is exiled by his brothers and taken to a foreign land. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness away from his countrymen. David is one of the many heroes that needed to be exiled. God does some of his most remarkable work when we are at our lowest points. In the prelude to our next episode, we will hear a story about another hero who spent time in the wilderness alone. He, like David, had a great destiny. Our destinies are not halted when we are put through intense trials. Rather, our destinies are confirmed through the refining of our character. In our next episode, David's character will indeed be tested. Our strong and mighty hero will show weakness in ways we haven't seen yet. We will question whether he is truly fit to be a king. David's failure will give us a sobering reminder that nobody but God is perfect. Join us for episode 9, David the Madman. Thanks again for listening. For more inspiring stories, daily prayers, and wisdom to last a lifetime, go to pray.com. Share this podcast with a family member or friend and help us spread God's word. God bless.
Hello, my name is Matthew Potter, co-founder of pray.com. I wanted to ask, do you know what your bank does with your money? At America's Christian Credit Union, your everyday banking helps grow churches, expand the reach of missions agencies, and supports fellow believers across the country. Learn more about specials for switching to ACCU and their nationwide banking capabilities at americaschristiancu.com/pray. Plus, the peace of mind knowing that this credit union is federally insured by the National Credit Union Administration.